Chapter 1. Before the S.H.I.E.L.D. Steve Rogers and the America that needed a symbol. Before the S.H.I.E.L.D., before the uniform, before the carefully constructed myth of Captain America, there was only Steve Rogers, a frail young man born into a world already defined by loss, instability, and the looming shadow of conflict, and understanding the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Captain America requires beginning not with heroism, but with weakness, because Steve Rogers is not introduced as a symbol of power, but as a challenge to the very definition of strength in America on the eve of the Second World War, a nation fractured by the Great Depression, fearful of foreign threats, and desperately searching for reassurance in its own moral identity. Steve grows up in Brooklyn during an era when survival itself is an act of endurance. Raised by a single mother after the death of his father, his childhood shaped by poverty, illness, and a fragile body that marks him as unsuitable for the traditional expectations of masculinity and patriotism that dominate the American cultural imagination of the 1930s and early 1940s. His asthma, heart problems, scoliosis, low muscle mass, and chronic frailty render him unfit not only for military service, but for the respect that society often reserves for those who can physically defend themselves. And yet, from the very beginning, Steve Rogers demonstrates that his physical weakness does not translate into moral passivity, because he refuses to accept injustice even when resisting it puts him in danger, repeatedly standing up to bullies far larger and stronger than himself, with a stubborn insistence that violence should never be allowed to go unchallenged, simply because it is inevitable. This impulse is not rooted in recklessness or a desire for recognition, but in an instinctive moral clarity that defines Steve long before he is ever considered for Project Rebirth, as seen in his willingness to fight even when he knows he will lose, not because he expects to win, but because he believes that surrendering to cruelty is a greater defeat than physical pain. The America in which Steve comes of age is an America wrestling with its conscience, torn between isolationism and intervention, haunted by the memories of the First World War, and uncertain whether it should once again involve itself in a global conflict that threatens to engulf Europe. And it is precisely this uncertainty that makes Steve Rogers such a compelling figure within the MCU's historical framework, because he embodies the tension between fear and responsibility that defines the nation at that time. While many Americans are reluctant to enlist, wary of sacrificing their lives for causes that feel distant or abstract, Steve's desire to serve is immediate, personal, and unwavering, not because he glorifies war, but because he believes that allowing tyranny to spread unchecked is itself a moral failure, a belief that stands in stark contrast to the cynicism and fatigue that pervade much of the public discourse. His repeated attempts to enlist in the U.S. Army, despite being rejected multiple times for medical reasons, are not played for comedy alone, but function as a narrative demonstration of his defining trait, an unbreakable commitment to doing what he believes is right, even when the institutions designed to protect the nation deem him unworthy of participation. In these moments, the MCU carefully constructs Steve Rogers not as a patriotic caricature, but as a deeply human figure whose patriotism is rooted in ethical conviction rather than blind nationalism, a distinction that will become increasingly important as his story unfolds across later films. Steve's friendship with James "Bucky" Barnes further contextualizes his character, presenting a relationship built on loyalty, mutual protection, and shared hardship rather than dominance or hierarchy, where Bucky, physically stronger and more confident, does not mock Steve's weakness but defends him, and Steve, in turn, offers Bucky an emotional anchor that reflects his capacity for empathy and trust. This relationship serves as an emotional microcosm of the broader themes that will later define Captain America's arc, including loyalty to individuals over institutions, the pain of loss, and the devastating consequences of war on personal identity. Importantly, Steve's patriotism is never portrayed as allegiance to a flag alone, but as allegiance to people, to the vulnerable, and to the idea that power must be accountable to moral responsibility, a philosophy that sets him apart from many contemporaries who view military service as a path to glory or validation. The Marvel Cinematic Universe emphasizes this distinction early on by showing Steve's artistic side, his habit of sketching scenes of daily life, war propaganda posters, and imagined heroism, revealing a reflective, observant nature that contrasts with the brute force typically associated with soldiers, and suggesting that Steve is someone who sees the world not as a battlefield to be conquered, but as a community worth protecting. His encounter with Dr. Abraham Erskine becomes the pivotal moment where Steve's inner qualities are recognized by someone who understands that the true danger of power lies not in its absence but in its misuse. And, although the serum has not yet been administered at this point in the narrative, Erskine's interest in Steve is driven entirely by what Steve represents before transformation, not after. When Steve states that he does not want to kill anyone but hates bullies, regardless of where they come from, he articulates the moral foundation upon which the entire Captain America identity will be built, a foundation that rejects the glorification of violence while acknowledging the necessity of resistance against oppression. This moment is critical within the MCU canon because it reframes heroism as a moral stance rather than a physical capability, reinforcing the idea that the super soldier serum does not create Steve Rogers' character, but merely amplifies what already exists within him. The pre-S.H.I.E.L.D. Steve Rogers exists in a liminal space between insignificance and destiny, a man overlooked by systems designed to identify strength, yet intuitively understood by those who value integrity over efficiency. And this contrast reflects a broader critique of institutional thinking within the MCU, which repeatedly explores the dangers of valuing results over ethics. Steve's America needs a symbol not because it lacks military power, but because it lacks moral certainty. And in a world where fear-driven decisions threaten to erode democratic values, the idea of a hero who cannot be corrupted by power becomes a narrative necessity rather than a patriotic fantasy. The film deliberately positions Steve as an answer to a philosophical question, rather than a tactical one, asking whether goodness can survive when magnified by power, and whether a nation can trust its own symbols to remain true to their original purpose. Before the S.H.I.E.L.D., Steve Rogers is already a rebuke to the idea that greatness must be earned through dominance, and instead proposes that greatness is revealed through consistency, compassion, and the refusal to compromise one's values under pressure. In this sense, the MCU's portrayal of Steve Rogers is less about the birth of a superhero and more about the preservation of a moral ideal at a moment in history when that ideal is most vulnerable, and by grounding Captain America's origin in weakness rather than strength, the narrative ensures that everything that follows, every battle, every sacrifice, and every ideological conflict is anchored to a simple but profound truth, that the measure of a hero is not what he can do, but why he chooses to do it. Chapter 2: Project Rebirth and the Creation of Captain America. Project Rebirth emerges within the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a response not merely to the strategic demands of global war, but to a deeper existential fear that the coming conflict will be decided not only by armies and weapons, but by ideology itself. And, in this climate, Dr. Abraham Erskine's work represents a quiet rebellion against the prevailing logic of militarization, because his vision for the super soldier program is fundamentally philosophical rather than tactical. rooted in the belief that amplifying the wrong individual would not create a protector, but a tyrant. Erskine's experience in Europe, particularly his forced collaboration with Johann Schmidt and the early Hydra experiments, has taught him that physical enhancement divorced from moral restraint produces monsters rather than heroes, and it is this lesson that informs every decision he makes once he is brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip-like secrecy, carrying with him not only the formula for the serum, but the guilt of having seen its potential corrupted. When Steve Rogers is selected for Project Rebirth, it is not because he meets any traditional military criteria, but because Erskine recognizes in him the rare combination of empathy, humility, and moral courage that the serum requires to function as intended, reinforcing the MCU's central assertion that power does not change who a person is, but reveals who they have always been. The transformation sequence itself is deliberately framed not as a moment of triumph, but as a moment of profound vulnerability, with Steve willingly submitting his body to a process he barely understands, trusting Erskine completely despite the risk of death, a trust that underscores the depth of his character and the absence of ego in his desire to serve. As the Vita Ray chamber seals and the serum courses through Steve's body, the visual language emphasizes pain, uncertainty, and sacrifice rather than spectacle, presenting the rebirth of Captain America as something earned through suffering rather than bestowed as a reward. When Steve emerges transformed, physically perfected, yet emotionally unchanged, the contrast between his new body and his unchanged demeanor becomes one of the most important thematic signals in the MCU, because it demonstrates that the serum has not altered his values, only given them the capacity to be expressed through action. This moment is immediately followed by the assassination of Erskine, a narrative choice that removes the moral architect of the project at the exact moment of its success, ensuring that Steve is left without guidance, forced to interpret Erskine's philosophy on his own in a world eager to repurpose him as a tool rather than a symbol. The loss of Erskine is not merely personal, but ideological, because with his death the super soldier program loses its ethical compass, and the US military, under figures like Colonel Chester Phillips and Senator Brandt, begins to view Steve less as a man and more as an asset whose value lies in visibility rather than agency. The immediate pivot from battlefield deployment to propaganda tours reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what Captain America represents, as Steve is dressed in bright colors, sent on stage, and instructed to sell war bonds while soldiers fight and die overseas, a decision that reflects America's discomfort with trusting moral authority to an individual rather than controlling it through bureaucracy. This phase of Steve's journey is critical because it tests his patience and conviction more deeply than any physical challenge, forcing him to confront the possibility that the system he volunteered to defend may never fully trust him to act independently. And yet, even in this role, Steve refuses to become cynical, performing his duties while quietly observing the disconnect between the image of heroism being sold at home and the reality of war unfolding abroad. His eventual decision to disobey orders and travel overseas to rescue captured soldiers, including Bucky Barnes, marks the first time Steve actively chooses principle over protocol as Captain America, signaling the beginning of a lifelong pattern that will define his conflicts with institutions like S.H.I.E.L.D. and later the Avengers. This act of insubordination is not framed as rebellion for its own sake, but as a logical extension of Erskine's teachings, because Steve understands that symbols without action are hollow, and that moral authority must be exercised, not merely displayed. When Steve dons the refined Captain America uniform and leads a rescue mission into Hydra territory, the MCU reframes his identity from a manufactured icon into a self-determined leader, someone who earns loyalty not through rank or intimidation, but through example, inspiring soldiers to follow him because they trust his judgment rather than fear his power. The contrast between Steve Rogers and Johann Schmidt becomes increasingly pronounced during this phase, as Schmidt's transformation into the Red Skull serves as a dark mirror to Steve's own, illustrating the divergent outcomes of the same experiment applied to fundamentally different characters, where Schmidt's obsession with dominance and destiny leads him to abandon humanity entirely, while Steve's humility anchors him more firmly within it. Project Rebirth, in this sense, succeeds not because it creates a perfect soldier, but because it proves Erskine's hypothesis that goodness, when amplified, can withstand the corrupting influence of power, even in the absence of oversight. The destruction of the remaining serum and the loss of Erskine ensure that Steve remains unique, not only biologically but morally, preventing the replication of his transformation and reinforcing the idea that Captain America cannot be mass-produced, because what makes him effective is not the formula, but the character that wields it. As Steve begins to operate on the front lines, leading the Howling Commandos and directly confronting Hydra, his actions gradually realign the meaning of the symbol he represents, shifting Captain America away from propaganda and toward lived heroism, grounded in sacrifice, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others rather than dominating enemies. Project Rebirth, therefore, is not simply the origin of a superhero within the MCU, but a philosophical experiment whose true subject is not Steve Rogers' body, but his moral resilience, and its outcome will echo across decades of history, shaping not only the man who carries the shield, but the ethical framework of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, as Captain America becomes a living argument that power, when guided by conscience rather than ambition, can remain a force for good even in a world defined by war. Chapter 3: War, Myth, and the Price of Becoming a Legend. As Steve Rogers steps fully into the theater of war, the Marvel Cinematic Universe deliberately blurs the boundary between history and mythology, presenting Captain America as both a soldier embedded in the brutal mechanics of global conflict and a living symbol whose very presence reshapes morale, perception, and the meaning of heroism itself. And this duality becomes the central tension of his wartime experience. Once freed from the constraints of propaganda and placed on the front lines, Steve does not merely participate in the war against Hydra. He transforms how the war is fought and remembered, because his actions are amplified not only by the serum that enhances his body, but by the narrative power of what he represents to those who fight alongside him. The formation of the Howling Commandos marks a crucial shift in Steve's role, moving him from a solitary icon into a leader of men, and the MCU takes care to portray this leadership as earned rather than assumed, built through shared danger, mutual respect, and a willingness to place himself in harm's way before asking anyone else to follow. Unlike traditional officers who command from a distance, Steve leads from the front, absorbing risk as a moral obligation rather than a tactical calculation, and in doing so, he begins to create the legend of Captain America not through spectacle, but through consistency, as soldiers come to associate the shield not with invincibility, but with reliability in the chaos of battle. Yet, the more Steve succeeds, the more the myth of Captain America grows beyond his control, shaped by newsreels, posters, and whispered stories that simplify complex realities into digestible symbols. And this process introduces a subtle but persistent cost, because myth-making flattens the human dimension of Steve's experience, turning sacrifice into inspiration while obscuring trauma, fear, and doubt. The MCU presents this tension through Steve's evolving relationship with the war itself. As initial clarity, gives way to a deeper understanding of its consequences, particularly as he witnesses the devastation left by Hydra's advanced weaponry, which threatens not only military targets but civilian populations, reinforcing the idea that technological superiority, divorced from ethical restraint, leads inevitably to dehumanization. Steve's confrontations with Hydra are therefore framed not merely as battles against an enemy faction, but as clashes between competing visions of the future, where Hydra's obsession with power and control stands in opposition to Steve's belief in freedom, accountability, and the intrinsic value of individual lives. This ideological conflict reaches its apex in Steve's encounters with Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull, whose transformation into a monstrous figure serves as a visual and thematic embodiment of what happens when ambition eclipses humanity. And while Schmidt views himself as the rightful architect of a new world order, Steve remains grounded in the belief that no individual has the right to impose destiny on others through force. The war amplifies these differences, turning their rivalry into a symbolic struggle that transcends personal animosity, positioning Captain America as a counter-myth to Hydra's vision of inevitability, asserting that the future is shaped by choices rather than destiny. However, the MCU refuses to romanticize Steve's role entirely, instead emphasizing the accumulating emotional cost of leadership, as each victory brings not triumph, but responsibility, and each loss reinforces the weight of the lives entrusted to him. The death of fellow soldiers, the suffering of prisoners, and the ever-present risk of failure erode the simplicity of Steve's initial resolve, replacing it with a quieter, more burdened determination that acknowledges the limits of even enhanced strength. This evolution is most evident in Steve's relationship with Bucky Barnes, whose apparent death during a mission against Hydra becomes a defining trauma that permanently alters Steve's perception of the war, forcing him to confront the reality that even his best efforts cannot guarantee the safety of those he loves. Bucky's loss strips away any remaining illusions Steve may have held about control, teaching him that leadership often means carrying guilt without the possibility of absolution, a lesson that will echo throughout his later life as Captain America. As the legend of Captain America continues to grow, Steve becomes increasingly aware that symbols can inspire but also obscure, creating expectations that no individual can fully meet. And the MCU subtly explores this tension by juxtaposing scenes of public celebration with moments of private grief, underscoring the isolation that accompanies becoming a living icon. The shield, once a practical tool of defense, begins to function as a visual shorthand for hope. And while Steve embraces this role, he never allows himself to forget that hope must be grounded in action rather than appearance, a principle that guides his decisions even as the war reaches its most desperate phase. The culmination of Steve's wartime journey arrives with the realization that the conflict cannot be ended through conventional victory alone, as Hydra's ambitions extend beyond territorial conquest into the realm of existential threat, embodied by the Red Skull's pursuit of the Tesseract and the power it represents. Faced with the imminent destruction of millions, Steve is forced to confront the ultimate cost of heroism, recognizing that the only way to stop Hydra's final plan is through an act of irreversible sacrifice, one that will erase his future in order to protect others. This decision is not framed as destiny or obligation, but as a choice made freely, consistent with the values that defined Steve long before the serum, reinforcing the MCU's assertion that true heroism lies in the willingness to give up everything without expectation of reward. As Steve pilots the plane into the Arctic, fully aware that he will not survive, the legend of Captain America crystallizes around a single defining act, transforming him from a wartime hero into a timeless symbol of selflessness. And yet, the film ensures that this moment is not triumphant but solemn, emphasizing loss rather than victory. The war ends not with celebration for Steve Rogers, but with silence, his body preserved beneath the ice as the world moves on without him. And in this final image of the chapter, the MCU encapsulates the central paradox of Captain America's myth, that becoming a legend often requires the surrender of one's humanity, even as that legend is built upon profoundly human choices. The price of becoming Captain America is therefore not paid in blood alone, but in time, memory, and the forfeiture of a life that might have been lived differently. And as the world remembers him as a symbol of victory, Steve Rogers disappears into history as a man who gave everything to ensure that others could have a future, setting the stage for the profound dislocation and moral reckoning that will define his story when he is eventually pulled back into a world that no longer resembles the one he saved. Chapter 4: The Sacrifice That Froze Time. Steve Rogers' final act of the Second World War represents one of the most thematically dense moments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because it is not framed as the climax of a heroic ascent, but as the quiet, irrevocable conclusion of a life defined by sacrifice long before it ever intersected with power. And in choosing to crash the Valkyrie into the Arctic, Steve does not fulfill a destiny imposed upon him by myth or nation, but completes a moral trajectory that began the moment he first refused to back down from a bully in a Brooklyn alley. The decision to divert the aircraft is presented without spectacle or grand speeches, emphasizing instead the inevitability of the choice once Steve understands the stakes, because the logic of his character leaves no room for alternatives that preserve his own survival at the cost of countless others. In this moment, the MCU crystallizes its interpretation of Captain America as a figure whose heroism is not reactive but anticipatory, someone who does not wait to be forced into sacrifice, but actively claims responsibility when no one else can, fully aware of the personal cost. The brief radio exchange with Peggy Carter serves as the emotional anchor of the sequence, grounding an abstract act of global salvation in a deeply personal loss, and the restraint of the scene is critical, as neither character indulges in melodrama or denial, instead clinging to small human details like music and future plans that both know will never come to pass. This quiet intimacy underscores the central tragedy of Steve Rogers' arc, that his greatest contribution to the world requires the erasure of his own future, including the possibility of a life defined by love, peace, and self-determination rather than duty. When Steve tells Peggy that he has a date, it is not merely a promise deferred, but a symbolic acknowledgement of everything he is giving up, a recognition that the life he imagined for himself will exist only as an unfulfilled potential frozen alongside him beneath the ice. The crash itself is depicted with a sense of finality rather than chaos, reinforcing the idea that this is not a desperate gamble but a resolved conclusion. And as the aircraft disappears into the Arctic, the MCU deliberately avoids offering immediate emotional release, allowing silence and stillness to replace the noise of war, visually signaling that Steve's story, at least as he understands it, has reached its end. The subsequent discovery of the frozen shield embedded in the ice functions as a powerful metaphor for suspended ideals, preserved but inaccessible, as the world transitions into a new geopolitical reality shaped by technological acceleration, shifting alliances, and emerging institutions like S.H.I.E.L.D, which will later claim stewardship over Steve's legacy without fully understanding the principles that defined it. Steve's body, encased in ice and hidden from history, becomes a relic of a moral clarity that the post-war world gradually loses, as fear of new enemies replaces the unity forged by shared sacrifice. And the Cold War context retroactively imbues Steve's absence with symbolic weight, suggesting that his disappearance creates a vacuum where compromise, secrecy, and ethical ambiguity flourish. In this sense, Steve's sacrifice does not merely end a war, it inaugurates an era in which his values are increasingly at odds with the systems that claim to protect humanity, an irony that will only become apparent when he is eventually revived. The MCU reinforces this idea by presenting Steve's presumed death not as a moment of national reckoning, but as a narrative convenience for institutions eager to move forward without grappling with the uncomfortable implications of his example, allowing Captain America to become a static symbol rather than a living moral challenge. This transformation from man to legend is essential to understanding the cost of Steve's sacrifice, because while his actions save millions, they also enable a version of his identity that can be selectively remembered, celebrated, and sanitized, stripped of the inconvenient principles that might complicate future decisions. The passage of time while Steve remains frozen operates as a narrative device that amplifies this dissonance. As decades pass and the world Steve fought for evolves into something both recognizable and alien, shaped by technological progress but morally fragmented, with new threats emerging that are less clearly defined than the fascism he opposed. Steve's preservation in ice ensures that he does not participate in these transformations, leaving him untouched by compromise, but also isolated from the lived experience of the world he saved, a condition that will later define his profound sense of displacement and grief. From a thematic perspective, the freezing of Steve Rogers functions as an extreme extension of the soldier's experience, where service demands not only the risk of death, but the forfeiture of personal continuity, identity, and belonging, turning Steve into a man permanently severed from his own time. The MCU's choice to literalize this condition underscores its broader meditation on the costs of heroism, suggesting that even survival does not guarantee wholeness, and that some sacrifices are so complete that they transcend death itself. Steve's sacrifice also serves as a narrative fulcrum for the franchise, establishing a moral benchmark against which future heroes will be measured, as his willingness to die without witnesses, accolades, or certainty of remembrance stands in stark contrast to later conflicts defined by ego, accountability, and public perception. Importantly, the MCU resists framing Steve's action as inevitable or predestined, instead emphasizing that it is the culmination of countless small choices, rooted in empathy, responsibility, and an unwavering refusal to accept that someone else should pay a price he is able to bear himself. This distinction reinforces the idea that heroism is not a singular moment, but a pattern of behavior, and that the final sacrifice is meaningful only because it is consistent with everything that precedes it. As the world moves on, and Steve remains frozen, the shield becomes a historical artifact rather than a living symbol, and Captain America transitions from a participant in history to a mythic figure whose story is told rather than lived, a shift that allows his image to be preserved while his voice is silenced. The irony of this preservation lies in the fact that Steve's greatest strength, his moral clarity, cannot be frozen or replicated, leaving future generations with the appearance of heroism, but not its guiding conscience. In this way, the sacrifice that freezes time is not merely a plot device to transport Steve into the modern era, but a deliberate narrative choice that transforms him into a moral anomaly, a man whose values remain fixed while the world around him changes, ensuring that when he is eventually awakened, he will function not as a relic to be admired, but as a mirror held up to a society that must confront how far it has drifted from the ideals he embodied. The ice does not preserve Steve Rogers as he was, but rather suspends a question that the MCU will continue to ask across multiple films: whether a world shaped by fear, secrecy, and power can still make room for a hero who believes that doing the right thing, matters more than winning, and whether such a hero can survive not only the physical challenges of modern threats, but the moral compromises that define the age he is about to enter. Chapter 5: A Man Out of His Time. Awakening in the Modern World. Steve Rogers' awakening in the 21st century is presented in the Marvel Cinematic Universe not as a triumphant return, but as a profound psychological rupture, because survival in this context is not a victory, but an extension of loss, and the moment he opens his eyes marks the beginning of a second life, defined not by choice, but by displacement. The carefully constructed illusion of a 1940s hospital room designed by S.H.I.E.L.D. collapses almost immediately, and with it the last fragile connection Steve has to the world he knew, as he realizes that the familiar sights and sounds meant to comfort him are artificial, an institutional decision that reflects a broader tendency to manage heroes rather than trust them, and which immediately places Steve in quiet opposition to the systems that now surround him. Nick Fury's introduction is deliberately restrained, positioning him as a man who understands the weight of truth, but also the necessity of control, and this first interaction establishes the uneasy dynamic that will define Steve's relationship with modern authority, as Fury offers information selectively, framing Steve's survival as a strategic asset while attempting to soften the emotional impact of 70 years of lost time. The revelation that Peggy Carter is now elderly, her life lived without him, becomes the emotional axis around which Steve's displacement revolves, because it transforms abstract loss into something immediate and irreversible, confronting him with the reality that the world he fought for not only continued without him, but moved beyond the version of himself that once belonged to it. Unlike other heroes whose origins are rooted in the modern era, Steve must process cultural, technological, and moral shifts simultaneously, navigating a society defined by constant surveillance, rapid information exchange, and geopolitical complexity, all of which stand in contrast to the more binary moral landscape of his past. The MCU emphasizes this disorientation through small, human details rather than grand exposition, from Steve's confusion at modern technology to his quiet moments of reflection as he sketches scenes from memory, using art as a means of preserving an identity that no longer has a place in the present. Steve's list of cultural references he needs to catch up on, often played for humor, functions narratively as a coping mechanism, a way for him to impose order on a world that feels overwhelming. And this subtle characterization reinforces the idea that Steve approaches even personal trauma with discipline and intentionality, choosing adaptation over withdrawal. Yet beneath this surface-level adjustment lies a deeper moral unease, as Steve begins to recognize that the world he saved has not resolved the ethical tensions that defined his era, but merely transformed them, replacing overt fascism with more ambiguous threats and trading clear enemies for shifting alliances and covert operations. The reactivation of Captain America is therefore not presented as a seamless continuation of his wartime role, but as a reluctant necessity driven by the emergence of new dangers that challenge Steve's belief in transparency, accountability, and individual agency. His introduction to the Avengers initiative places him among individuals whose motivations and values vary widely, and this diversity immediately highlights Steve's role as a moral counterweight rather than a tactical leader, as his perspective is shaped by a lifetime of sacrifice rather than personal ambition. Steve's interactions with Tony Stark are particularly significant during this phase, as they embody a clash between two visions of heroism, one rooted in responsibility and restraint, the other in innovation and self-determination. And while their mutual respect is evident, their differences foreshadow ideological conflicts that will later fracture the team. In contrast, Steve's bond with Natasha Romanoff reflects a quieter understanding between individuals shaped by loss and secrecy, with Natasha recognizing in Steve a moral anchor she lacks, and Steve sensing in her a depth of experience that challenges his more idealistic worldview. The Battle of New York becomes the crucible in which Steve's place in the modern world is tested, forcing him to transition from symbol to strategist in a crisis that demands rapid adaptation and trust in unfamiliar allies. And his ability to assume leadership under pressure demonstrates that while his context has changed, his core principles remain intact. Steve's leadership during the invasion is characterized by clarity, delegation, and an unwavering focus on civilian protection, reinforcing the idea that his value lies not in overpowering enemies, but in organizing resistance and maintaining ethical priorities amid chaos. The aftermath of the battle, however, leaves Steve confronting a world that celebrates victory while glossing over its costs, a familiar pattern that echoes his wartime experience and reinforces his sense of being perpetually out of step with the narratives imposed by institutions. His choice to remain active as Captain America is therefore not an embrace of modernity, but a conscious decision to serve as a stabilizing force within it, using his presence to challenge complacency and remind both allies and adversaries that power must be exercised with restraint. The MCU uses Steve's displacement to explore the psychological toll of survival without belonging, presenting him as a man who exists between eras, unable to fully return to the past yet unwilling to surrender his values to the present. And this tension becomes the defining characteristic of his modern identity. Steve's continued attachment to Peggy, despite knowing that their life together is impossible, illustrates his refusal to abandon emotional truth for convenience, a trait that will later place him at odds with systems that prioritize efficiency over humanity. In choosing to live in the present while remaining anchored to the past, Steve embodies a form of moral continuity that challenges the assumption that progress necessarily entails ethical improvement, suggesting instead that certain values must be actively preserved rather than passively inherited. His awakening is thus not the beginning of a new chapter, but the reopening of an unresolved question left frozen in the ice. Whether a man shaped by sacrifice can find purpose in a world that no longer measures heroism by the same standards, and whether Captain America can exist not as a relic or a weapon, but as a conscience in an age defined by complexity, compromise, and moral ambiguity. Chapter 6: The Avengers and the Burden of Moral Leadership. As Steve Rogers becomes fully integrated into the Avengers, the Marvel Cinematic Universe reframes his role from that of a solitary symbol into a moral center tasked with holding together a coalition of fundamentally different individuals, each carrying their own trauma, motivations, and definitions of heroism. And this shift introduces a new kind of burden that cannot be lifted by physical strength alone. Unlike traditional military units bound by hierarchy and shared training, the Avengers are assembled out of necessity rather than cohesion, united by external threat but divided by worldview, and Steve's leadership emerges not through authority or dominance, but through credibility earned by consistency, restraint, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others even when doing so complicates victory. Steve's approach to leadership is shaped by his wartime experience, but the modern context forces him to adapt those principles to a world where power is no longer monopolized by nations, and where individuals like Tony Stark, Thor, and Bruce Banner operate outside any conventional chain of command, each representing a different relationship to power, accountability, and identity. The tension between Steve and Tony Stark becomes the most visible expression of this ideological divergence, as Tony's reliance on technology, preemptive defense, and personal innovation contrasts sharply with Steve's belief in trust, transparency, and moral restraint. And while their initial collaboration during the Battle of New York demonstrates mutual respect, it also exposes fault lines that deepen as global threats escalate. Steve's discomfort with secrecy and unilateral decision-making is not rooted in naivety, but in lived experience, having witnessed how unchecked authority can be weaponized against the very people it claims to protect. And this perspective places him in quiet opposition to the increasing militarization of superhero activity under organizations like S.H.I.E.L.D, which frame oversight as protection while often obscuring accountability. The MCU explores this conflict through Steve's evolving relationship with Nick Fury, whose pragmatic approach to global security stands in contrast to Steve's insistence on ethical clarity, creating a dynamic where trust is provisional and shared goals coexist with fundamental disagreement. As the Avengers confront threats beyond Earth, including Loki and the Chitauri, Steve is forced to reconcile his belief in individual responsibility with the reality of collective action, learning to coordinate beings of vastly different capabilities while maintaining a focus on civilian safety and proportional response. His tactical decisions during the invasion of New York reveal a leader who prioritizes stabilization over domination, delegating tasks based on strengths while ensuring that no single individual becomes indispensable. A subtle but important distinction that reflects his aversion to centralized power. The aftermath of these battles introduces a new layer of moral complexity, as victory becomes increasingly intertwined with collateral damage, public scrutiny, and geopolitical consequences, forcing Steve to confront the limits of symbolic heroism in a world that demands accountability as much as inspiration. The Avengers' growing visibility transforms them into global actors whose actions shape international relations, and Steve's presence among them serves as a reminder that legitimacy must be earned through ethical conduct rather than assumed through strength. This burden intensifies as Steve becomes aware of initiatives like the Tesseract-based weapons program, which echo the same logic of escalation that defined Hydra's ambitions, reinforcing his belief that power, once normalized, inevitably seeks justification rather than restraint. Steve's leadership style, characterized by listening as much as directing, positions him as a stabilizing influence within the team, particularly in moments of internal conflict, where his ability to articulate shared values prevents fractures from immediately becoming schisms. Yet this role also isolates him, as moral leadership often requires standing apart rather than blending in, and Steve increasingly finds himself acting as a conscience rather than a commander, questioning decisions that others are willing to accept for the sake of expediency. The MCU does not present this position as easy or rewarding, instead emphasizing the emotional toll of being the one who insists on doing the right thing when the right thing is inconvenient, unpopular, or strategically suboptimal. Steve's relationship with Bruce Banner highlights this dynamic as he offers empathy rather than fear, recognizing the danger of defining individuals solely by their capacity for destruction, a lesson he applies equally to himself as a super soldier. Similarly, his trust in Natasha Romanoff evolves into a partnership built on mutual respect rather than moral judgment, demonstrating his capacity to see beyond past actions and focus on present intent. As the Avengers continue to operate, Steve becomes increasingly aware that the greatest threat they face may not be external, but internal, rooted in the tension between security and freedom, control and trust, and his growing unease foreshadows the ideological conflicts that will later tear the team apart. The burden of moral leadership is not defined by making perfect decisions, but by remaining accountable for imperfect ones, and Steve's willingness to shoulder responsibility without deflecting blame distinguishes him from both allies and adversaries. In a world where heroes are celebrated as commodities and weapons, Steve Rogers insists on being measured by his choices rather than his victories, reinforcing the MCU's central argument that leadership is not about commanding others to follow, but about modeling the values one expects others to uphold. This insistence places Steve on a collision course with institutions and individuals who prioritize outcomes over ethics, setting the stage for future conflicts that will challenge not only his alliances, but the very meaning of heroism in a world increasingly willing to trade principles for the illusion of safety. Chapter 7: The Winter Soldier: Truth, Betrayal, and Institutional Collapse. The revelation of the Winter Soldier marks the moment in the Marvel Cinematic Universe when Steve Rogers' faith in institutions finally fractures beyond repair, because the conflict he faces is no longer defined by foreign enemies or visible threats, but by the discovery that the very systems meant to safeguard freedom have been quietly hollowed out from within. What begins as a mission to stop a global security crisis rapidly transforms into a moral reckoning, as Steve uncovers evidence that Hydra did not die with the Second World War, but instead embedded itself deep inside S.H.I.E.L.D, exploiting secrecy, fear, and bureaucratic inertia to pursue a long-term strategy of control disguised as protection. This revelation is devastating precisely because it confirms Steve's deepest suspicions about unchecked authority, validating his belief that power without transparency inevitably corrodes the values it claims to defend, and forcing him to confront the reality that the post-war world has learned the wrong lessons from history. The existence of Project Insight, a system designed to eliminate potential threats before they can act, represents the logical extreme of this corrupted philosophy, translating fear into algorithmic judgment and reducing human beings to probabilities rather than moral agents, and Steve immediately recognizes it as a betrayal of everything he fought for, because it replaces accountability with inevitability and substitutes preemptive violence for ethical responsibility. The return of Bucky Barnes as the Winter Soldier transforms this ideological conflict into an intensely personal tragedy, collapsing the distance between past and present, and confronting Steve with the living embodiment of war's capacity to erase identity, memory, and choice. Bucky's reappearance is not framed as a dramatic twist alone, but as a cruel inversion of Steve's defining relationship, where the friend who once protected him has been stripped of agency and repurposed as a weapon, reinforcing the MCU's recurring theme that the greatest horrors are not acts of destruction, but acts of dehumanization. Steve's refusal to view Bucky as an enemy, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of his actions, underscores the core of his moral philosophy, which insists that individuals cannot be reduced to their worst deeds when those deeds are the result of coercion and manipulation, a stance that places him in direct conflict with a system designed to neutralize threats rather than understand them. As the conspiracy within S.H.I.E.L.D unravels, Steve is forced to make decisions without institutional backing, relying instead on trust in individuals like Natasha Romanoff and Sam Wilson, whose loyalty is earned through shared values rather than formal allegiance, and this shift marks the beginning of Steve's transformation from a sanctioned hero into a principled dissenter. The collapse of S.H.I.E.L.D is depicted not as a victory, but as a necessary implosion, a recognition that an organization so thoroughly compromised cannot be salvaged through reform alone, and Steve's role in exposing it positions him as a threat to centralized power even as he works to prevent catastrophic loss of life. His decision to publicly release classified information, stripping Hydra of secrecy and forcing the world to confront the truth, reflects his belief that transparency is not a liability, but a safeguard even when it introduces chaos and uncertainty. The final confrontation between Steve and Bucky is deliberately restrained, emphasizing emotional truth over spectacle, as Steve refuses to fight back, choosing instead to absorb violence rather than perpetuate it, a choice that encapsulates his rejection of utilitarian logic in favor of personal responsibility. By allowing himself to be beaten rather than abandoning his belief in Bucky's humanity, Steve demonstrates that moral resistance can take the form of endurance rather than domination, and this act becomes the emotional climax of the conflict, reaffirming the MCU's assertion that heroism is defined not by victory, but by fidelity to one's values under extreme pressure. The destruction of Project Insight and the exposure of Hydra come at an immense cost, dismantling global security structures and leaving a power vacuum that will have far-reaching consequences. But Steve accepts this uncertainty as preferable to the illusion of safety built on fear and coercion. In rejecting the logic of preemptive control, he asserts that freedom is inherently risky and that attempting to eliminate risk through surveillance and force ultimately destroys the very freedom such measures claim to protect. The Winter Soldier arc fundamentally redefines Steve Rogers' relationship with the world, severing his remaining trust in institutions and solidifying his allegiance to individuals over systems, a shift that will shape every subsequent decision he makes. By the end of this chapter, Captain America is no longer a symbol endorsed by authority, but a moral outlier willing to stand against the collective when the collective loses its way. And this transformation sets the stage for the ideological fracture that will soon divide the Avengers themselves, as the question of who should be allowed to decide the fate of others becomes impossible to ignore. Chapter 8: From Loyalty to Principle. The Road to Civil War. In the aftermath of the collapse of S.H.I.E.L.D., Steve Rogers finds himself navigating a world where the absence of centralized authority does not produce clarity, but rather exposes the fragility of the moral consensus that once held the Avengers together, and this period marks a subtle but decisive evolution in Steve's identity, as loyalty to institutions is gradually replaced by an uncompromising loyalty to principle. Operating as part of the so-called Secret Avengers alongside Sam Wilson and Natasha Romanoff, Steve continues to confront global threats without official sanction, not out of defiance but out of necessity, as the vacuum left by S.H.I.E.L.D's fall creates new spaces for instability, and the world's governments struggle to reconcile the existence of enhanced individuals with traditional frameworks of sovereignty and accountability. This tension becomes increasingly pronounced as the Avengers' interventions, though often successful in preventing catastrophic outcomes, generate unintended consequences that ripple across borders, fueling public fear and political pressure for regulation. Steve is acutely aware of these consequences, but his response is shaped by the lessons of his past, particularly the realization that surrendering moral agency to institutions does not prevent abuse, but merely obscures responsibility. And this belief places him at odds with those who view external oversight as a necessary evolution, rather than a potential threat. The emergence of the Sokovia Accords crystallizes this conflict, presenting a formal attempt to subject the Avengers to international control under the auspices of the United Nations, and while the Accords are framed as a mechanism for accountability, Steve immediately recognizes the inherent dangers of placing decision-making power in the hands of political bodies, whose priorities are shaped by shifting interests rather than consistent ethical standards. His opposition to the Accords is not rooted in a rejection of responsibility, but in a deep skepticism towards centralized authority informed by lived experience, particularly his confrontation with Hydra's infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D. which demonstrated how easily noble intentions can be corrupted when power is concentrated and shielded from transparency. Steve's internal conflict during this period is marked by restraint rather than aggression, as he carefully weighs the implications of resistance, aware that open defiance could fracture the Avengers and undermine public trust, yet unwilling to endorse a framework that would require him to act only when permitted, potentially forcing him to stand by while injustice unfolds. This struggle is further complicated by the reemergence of Bucky Barnes, now a fugitive hunted for crimes committed while under Hydra's control, and the international response to his presence exposes the limits of institutional justice, as governments prioritize containment and retribution over rehabilitation and truth. Steve's decision to protect Bucky, even at the cost of political fallout, reinforces his belief that moral responsibility cannot be outsourced, and that loyalty to individuals, particularly those stripped of agency, is not a weakness but a measure of integrity. The growing divide between Steve and Tony Stark during this period reflects a fundamental disagreement over how to respond to fear, with Tony viewing oversight as a means of preventing future harm, driven by guilt and the desire for redemption, while Steve sees it as a pathway to moral abdication, where responsibility is diluted across committees rather than owned by those with the power to act. Their conversations are marked by mutual respect but irreconcilable logic, as both men draw different conclusions from shared experiences, and the MCU deliberately avoids positioning either perspective as wholly right or wrong, instead framing the conflict as a tragic consequence of sincere but incompatible worldviews. As international pressure mounts and the Avengers are called to account for their actions, Steve's resistance becomes increasingly isolated, transforming him from a leader operating within a team to a dissenter preparing for open confrontation, a shift underscored by his growing reliance on personal judgment rather than consensus. The road to civil war is not paved with ideological extremism, but with incremental compromises and unresolved grief, as each character carries the weight of past failures into present decisions, and Steve's refusal to sign the Accords becomes a line he cannot cross without betraying the very principles that define him. This refusal is not dramatized as an act of rebellion, but as a quiet acknowledgement that some forms of control, no matter how well-intentioned, demand a surrender of conscience that Steve is unwilling to make. By choosing principle over loyalty to the Avengers as an institution, Steve accepts the inevitability of conflict, recognizing that unity enforced through coercion is ultimately more fragile than division grounded in honesty. The road to civil war, therefore, is less about political disagreement than about the collision between two visions of responsibility, one that seeks safety through structure, and one that seeks justice through individual moral agency. And Steve Rogers' path toward open defiance is marked not by anger or ambition, but by a steadfast refusal to allow fear to dictate the limits of ethical action, setting the stage for a confrontation that will test not only his relationships, but the very idea of what it means to be a hero in a world that no longer trusts its symbols. Chapter 9: Civil War and the Breaking of the Avengers. The conflict that erupts in civil war represents the inevitable collapse of a fragile equilibrium held together by shared trauma rather than shared belief. And within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this rupture is framed not as a descent into villainy, but as the tragic consequence of incompatible moral conclusions, drawn from the same history of loss, responsibility, and fear. When the Avengers fracture, they do so not because they abandon their values, but because they refuse to abandon them, and Steve Rogers finds himself at the center of this implosion, forced to confront the reality that moral integrity does not guarantee unity, and that choosing what one believes is right can sometimes mean standing against those one loves and respects. The implementation of the Sokovia Accords transforms ideological disagreement into enforced compliance, and Steve's refusal to submit places him outside the law, recasting a symbol of American heroism as an international fugitive, a narrative inversion that underscores how rapidly legitimacy can shift when authority is defined by paperwork rather than principle. The airport confrontation is not presented as a battle for dominance, but as a deeply uncomfortable manifestation of unresolved conflict, where former allies restrain rather than destroy one another, and where restraint itself becomes a moral statement, as Steve actively works to minimize harm even while resisting arrest. His leadership during this encounter is marked by a focus on protection rather than victory, prioritizing escape and preservation over triumph, a choice that reflects his continued rejection of utilitarian logic in favor of personal accountability. The presence of young heroes like Peter Parker further complicates the moral landscape, highlighting the generational consequences of the conflict and reinforcing Steve's concern that institutionalized control often exploits idealism rather than nurturing it, while Tony's recruitment of Peter reflects his belief that structure and mentorship can prevent future mistakes, illustrating how both men seek to protect others through fundamentally different means. As the conflict escalates, the true architect of the war, Helmut Zemo, remains deliberately peripheral, his plan not dependent on physical strength or ideological allegiance, but on psychological manipulation and the careful exploitation of unresolved grief, demonstrating that the Avengers' greatest vulnerability lies not in their power, but in their emotional scars. Zemo's success is rooted in his understanding that heroes, when stripped of clear enemies, will turn inward, and his orchestration of events ensures that the Avengers' fracture feels organic rather than forced, emerging from truths long buried rather than sudden betrayal. The revelation of Tony Stark's parents' murder at the hands of the Winter Soldier represents the emotional point of no return, collapsing ideological debate into raw, personal pain, and Steve's decision to withhold this information, motivated by a desire to protect Tony and Bucky alike, becomes the defining moral compromise of his arc, illustrating that even those committed to truth can falter when empathy collides with fear of irreversible harm. The final confrontation between Steve, Tony, and Bucky abandons all pretense of political disagreement, reducing the conflict to a brutal reckoning between friendship, guilt, and responsibility. And Steve's choice to stand between Tony and Bucky, even when it costs him his identity as Captain America, underscores his belief that moral responsibility includes protecting others from acting on their worst impulses. By relinquishing the shield, Steve symbolically rejects the authority that the title of Captain America has come to represent, asserting that the symbol cannot be allowed to justify actions that betray its original purpose, and in doing so, he completes his transformation from sanctioned hero to principled outcast. The imprisonment of his allies and his subsequent decision to free them marks a definitive break with institutional legitimacy, positioning Steve as a man willing to accept the consequences of his choices without seeking validation or forgiveness, and reinforcing the idea that accountability is personal rather than procedural. The breaking of the Avengers is not resolved through reconciliation or compromise, but left deliberately open, reflecting the MCU's willingness to allow ideological conflict to produce lasting consequences rather than narrative closure. Steve's letter to Tony, offering help without conditions while acknowledging their differences, encapsulates the tragedy of the Civil War, affirming that disagreement need not erase respect, even as it makes coexistence impossible. By the end of this chapter, Captain America exists without a nation, without a team, and without a symbol, defined solely by his principles and his willingness to act on them. And the Avengers, once a unified force, are left divided not by hatred but by the painful realization that doing the right thing does not always mean doing the same thing, a fracture that will leave them vulnerable in the face of threats far greater than any they have yet encountered. Chapter 10: Exile, Resistance, and the Shadow. Years in the wake of the Avengers collapse, Steve Rogers enters a period defined not by public heroism or ideological debate, but by quiet resistance carried out in the margins of a world that no longer recognizes his authority. And this exile marks one of the most psychologically complex phases of his journey in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as he is forced to operate without validation, symbols, or institutional support, relying solely on his internal compass to navigate an increasingly unstable global landscape. Stripped of the mantle of Captain America and officially designated a fugitive, Steve does not retreat from responsibility, but instead reframes it, choosing to act where he believes intervention is necessary, while deliberately avoiding visibility, a decision that reflects his understanding that legitimacy rooted in power can be both fragile and corruptible. Operating alongside a small network of allies including Sam Wilson, Natasha Romanoff, and the liberated Avengers imprisoned under the Sokovia Accords, Steve becomes the nucleus of an informal resistance defined not by rebellion for its own sake, but by a commitment to protect those whom institutions fail or abandon. These shadow years are characterized by constant motion and uncertainty, as Steve moves between safe houses and covert missions, aware that every action carries consequences not only for himself, but for those who choose to follow him. And this awareness deepens his sense of responsibility, even as it isolates him further from the world he once symbolized. The absence of official oversight does not liberate Steve from ethical constraint. Instead, it intensifies his accountability, because without institutional structures to absorb blame, every decision rests squarely on his conscience, forcing him to confront the reality that moral clarity does not simplify action, but often complicates it. During this period, Steve's leadership evolves into something quieter and more relational, grounded in trust rather than command, as he operates within a team bound not by rank or mandate, but by shared values and mutual respect, a model of cooperation that stands in deliberate contrast to the bureaucratic control embodied by the Accords. The world's response to the fractured Avengers further reinforces Steve's skepticism towards centralized authority, as governments struggle to fill the void left by the team's absence, revealing how deeply global security had come to rely on individuals rather than systems, and how ill-prepared those systems are to function without moral anchors. Steve observes these developments from the periphery, acutely aware that his removal from the public stage has not resolved the ethical dilemmas surrounding power and accountability, but merely displaced them, and this realization fuels his determination to remain active despite the personal cost. His relationship with Bucky Barnes during this time becomes one of mutual healing rather than protection, as both men confront the long-term consequences of war, trauma, and identity loss, and Steve's decision to help Bucky seek recovery in Wakanda reflects his belief that justice must include restoration, not merely punishment. This choice underscores Steve's growing alignment with a vision of heroism that prioritizes long-term well-being over immediate optics, even when such choices remove him further from the centers of power. The shadow years also deepen Steve's internal conflict regarding belonging, as he increasingly recognizes that the world he fights for may never fully accept the principles he embodies, and that his role may be destined to remain oppositional rather than representative. Unlike earlier phases of his life, where sacrifice was framed as a temporary necessity in service of eventual peace, this period offers no clear endpoint, only an ongoing commitment to act ethically within a system that often rewards compromise over integrity. The MCU presents this ambiguity not as a failure of heroism, but as its maturation, suggesting that true moral agency often exists outside formal recognition, sustained by conviction rather than applause. Steve's interactions with the remaining Avengers during this time are marked by restraint and empathy, as he avoids framing his choices as superior, acknowledging instead the sincerity of those who chose a different path, and this humility prevents his descent from calcifying into self-righteousness, preserving the moral openness that has always defined him. As global threats continue to emerge, Steve's resistance takes on a preventative dimension, as he works to contain dangers before they escalate, not out of a desire for control, but out of an understanding that absence of action can be as consequential as overreach. These operations, conducted without fanfare or recognition, reinforce the idea that heroism in the modern world may be most effective when it is least visible, operating beneath narratives shaped by politics and fear. The psychological toll of this existence is significant, as Steve grapples with isolation, fatigue, and the erosion of personal identity, no longer anchored by the title that once gave his life structure, and yet he refuses to relinquish the values that define that title, carrying them forward even as the symbol itself lies dormant. This separation between identity and principle becomes one of the defining themes of the Shadow Years, as Steve demonstrates that Captain America was never the uniform or the shield, but a way of engaging with the world that remains intact even in exile. The approach of Thanos' threat casts a long shadow over this period, as fragmented intelligence and growing instability hint at a coming conflict that will test not only the planet's defenses, but the fractured moral landscape left in the wake of the Avengers division. Steve senses this looming danger, aware that the absence of unity will carry catastrophic consequences, and yet he also understands that unity imposed without reconciliation would be hollow, leaving the world vulnerable in different ways. As the shadow years draw to a close, Steve stands at a crossroads defined not by opportunity, but by necessity, poised to re-emerge not as a sanctioned leader or a symbol of national identity, but as a figure shaped by exile, loss, and hard-earned clarity, ready to confront a threat that will force the world to reckon with the cost of its divisions and the value of the principles he refused to abandon. Chapter 11: Infinity, War, and Endgame. Failure, Responsibility, and Redemption. The arrival of Thanos marks the moment when every unresolved fracture in the Marvel Cinematic Universe converges into a single, overwhelming reckoning. And for Steve Rogers, this confrontation is defined less by physical struggle than by the crushing realization that moral clarity, no matter how steadfast, does not guarantee victory in a universe governed by scale, inevitability, and loss. When Steve re-enters the public battlefield during the events of Infinity War, he does so without ceremony or symbolism, having abandoned the shield and the identity of Captain America as the world once understood it. And this visual transformation reflects a deeper internal shift, as he now fights not to uphold an idealized vision of heroism, but to prevent extinction itself. The fractured Avengers reunite out of necessity rather than reconciliation, and this uneasy coalition underscores the cost of their earlier division, as mistrust, guilt, and unresolved ideological conflict weaken their collective response to a threat that demands absolute unity. Steve's reunion with Tony Stark is marked by tension rather than relief, their unresolved Civil War conflict casting a long shadow over their ability to coordinate effectively, and the absence of reconciliation becomes one of the unspoken tragedies of Infinity War, as the universe's fate hinges on a team still divided by past choices. Steve's leadership during this conflict is subdued and pragmatic, shaped by the humility born of exile and failure, as he no longer assumes that doing the right thing will be enough, but continues to act because the alternative is moral surrender. His interactions with figures like T'Challa and the Wakandans reinforce his alignment with a form of leadership rooted in mutual respect and shared sacrifice, and the defense of Wakanda becomes a moment where Steve's values briefly find resonance in a society that balances tradition, power, and accountability more effectively than those he left behind. Despite their efforts, the Avengers fail, and this failure is not framed as a temporary setback but as an existential rupture, as Thanos succeeds in erasing half of all life, rendering every previous conflict, debate, and compromise painfully irrelevant in the face of irreversible loss. Steve's response to this defeat is marked by quiet devastation rather than rage. His immediate concern focused on those who have been lost rather than on vengeance, and his whispered acknowledgement that they lost encapsulates the emotional weight of a man who has lived long enough to recognize that some failures cannot be reframed or rationalized. The 5-year gap that follows becomes a period of suspended grief, mirroring Steve's earlier displacement in time. But this time, the loss is not personal alone, but universal, and his role during this era reflects a final evolution of his leadership as he chooses to help others process trauma rather than attempting to impose meaning on an incomprehensible catastrophe. Leading support groups and encouraging survivors to rebuild, Steve embodies a form of heroism defined not by combat but by endurance and empathy, acknowledging that survival itself is now an act of resistance against despair. The emergence of a plan to reverse the snap forces Steve to confront the possibility of hope tempered by responsibility, as the stakes now include not only success, but the ethical implications of altering time and restoring lives without erasing the experiences of those who endured the aftermath. Throughout Endgame, Steve's actions are characterized by restraint and trust, placing faith in others' expertise rather than asserting authority, a reflection of his acceptance that leadership does not require control, but coordination and humility. The final battle against Thanos represents the culmination of Steve's journey, as he once again stands alone against overwhelming odds, S.H.I.E.L.D. broken and allies fallen, embodying the same refusal to yield that defined him as a young man in Brooklyn. And when he chooses to stand rather than surrender, the MCU completes a thematic circle that links his earliest defiance to his final stand. The arrival of the restored heroes transforms this moment from isolation into collective resolve, and Steve's simple command to assemble carries the weight of every sacrifice, loss, and moral choice that preceded it, uniting disparate narratives into a single act of shared resistance. Victory, when it comes, is not triumphant but costly, as Tony Stark's sacrifice mirrors Steve's own wartime decision decades earlier, forcing Steve to confront survival once again, now burdened by the loss of a man whose ideological conflict with him was never fully resolved. In the aftermath, Steve faces a final responsibility not to the world but to himself, as he is entrusted with returning the Infinity Stones, a task that offers him something he has been denied since the Arctic crash: the possibility of choice unshaped by immediate crisis. Steve's decision to remain in the past and live a life with Peggy Carter is not framed as abandonment, but as fulfillment, a recognition that a lifetime of sacrifice does not preclude the right to personal happiness, and that heroism does not demand endless suffering. By choosing to stay, Steve accepts that his role as Captain America has reached its natural conclusion, and that preserving the future may sometimes require stepping aside rather than standing at the center of it. This choice completes his arc from self-denial to self-acceptance, transforming survival from a burden into a gift, and allowing redemption not through victory alone, but through balance, as Steve Rogers finally claims a life defined not by war, but by the peace he spent decades defending. Chapter 10: Exile, Resistance, and the Shadow. Years in the wake of the Avengers' collapse, Steve Rogers enters a period defined not by public heroism or ideological debate, but by quiet resistance carried out in the margins of a world that no longer recognizes his authority. And this exile marks one of the most psychologically complex phases of his journey in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as he is forced to operate without validation, symbols, or institutional support, relying solely on his internal compass to navigate an increasingly unstable global landscape. Stripped of the mantle of Captain America and officially designated a fugitive, Steve does not retreat from responsibility, but instead reframes it, choosing to act where he believes intervention is necessary, while deliberately avoiding visibility, a decision that reflects his understanding that legitimacy rooted in power can be both fragile and corruptible. Operating alongside a small network of allies including Sam Wilson, Natasha Romanoff, and the liberated Avengers imprisoned under the Sokovia Accords, Steve becomes the nucleus of an informal resistance defined not by rebellion for its own sake, but by a commitment to protect those whom institutions fail or abandon. These shadow years are characterized by constant motion and uncertainty, as Steve moves between safe houses and covert missions, aware that every action carries consequences not only for himself, but for those who choose to follow him. And this awareness deepens his sense of responsibility, even as it isolates him further from the world he once symbolized. The absence of official oversight does not liberate Steve from ethical constraint. Instead, it intensifies his accountability, because without institutional structures to absorb blame, every decision rests squarely on his conscience, forcing him to confront the reality that moral clarity does not simplify action, but often complicates it. During this period, Steve's leadership evolves into something quieter and more relational, grounded in trust rather than command, as he operates within a team bound not by rank or mandate, but by shared values and mutual respect, a model of cooperation that stands in deliberate contrast to the bureaucratic control embodied by the Accords. The world's response to the fractured Avengers further reinforces Steve's skepticism towards centralized authority, as governments struggle to fill the void left by the team's absence, revealing how deeply global security had come to rely on individuals rather than systems, and how ill-prepared those systems are to function without moral anchors. Steve observes these developments from the periphery, acutely aware that his removal from the public stage has not resolved the ethical dilemmas surrounding power and accountability, but merely displaced them, and this realization fuels his determination to remain active despite the personal cost. His relationship with Bucky Barnes during this time the audience to reconsider the nature of patriotism, separating love of country from obedience to authority, and redefining it as a commitment to shared human dignity, rather than national supremacy. Steve Rogers never fought for America as a political entity alone, but for the idea that freedom, once compromised, cannot be protected by control or fear. And this distinction becomes increasingly relevant as the mantle passes to a new generation, facing different but equally profound challenges. The shield, scarred and weathered, becomes a tangible record of this philosophy, bearing the marks of conflict but remaining intact, a symbol not of invincibility, but of endurance and responsibility. Steve's absence from the world stage does not diminish his influence, but clarifies it as his example continues to shape decisions, inspire resistance to injustice, and remind others that the measure of a hero is not found in power, but in restraint. In stepping away, Steve completes a paradoxical arc in which the man who once gave up everything for the world finally allows the world to move forward without him, trusting that the values he lived by are strong enough to survive without constant defense. The legacy of Captain America within the MCU is thus not a closed chapter, but an open question, posed to every hero who follows, whether they will use power to control outcomes or to protect choice, whether they will prioritize safety over freedom or accept risk in defense of dignity. and whether they will remember that symbols gain meaning only when matched by action. Steve Rogers' story endures not because he was perfect, but because he was consistent, choosing again and again to do the right thing even when it cost him everything, and finally choosing to live when he had earned the right to rest, leaving behind a shield that no longer belongs to the past, but to the future he believed in, long before the world was ready to believe in it.